The dog had already been given a date, not a transfer date, not a reassessment date, a termination date, written in red ink on a form that nobody in the building wanted to touch, slid to the back of a manila folder, and filed somewhere between bureaucratic indifference and exhausted resignation. 7 years of combat service, 2 deployments, 17 confirmed explosive detections. And in 3 days, Sergeant Major Boone was going to be put down because nobody in the United States Army knew what to do with a 110-pound Belgian Malinois who hadn't eaten in 11 days and had put 2 handlers in the infirmary. Neva Birch, no, wait. Lena Farris was the one who found out about the dog by accident. She was 31 years old, a trauma nurse at Whitmore Regional Medical Center in Fayetteville, North Carolina, had been for 6 years, and she had never in her career asked to be involved in anything that wasn't her direct patient load. She kept her head down. She did her work. She went home to her apartment and her elderly cat, and whatever paperwork had followed her out the door. She was not, by any reasonable definition, a person who went looking for trouble. But she was also the nurse who had been assigned to Corporal Dean Pruitt on a Tuesday morning in March when he came in with a fractured wrist, 3 cracked ribs, and a look in his eyes that she had seen before. The particular hollow distance of someone who had done something they couldn't take back. She had not asked him about it. She had cleaned the wounds and set the wrist and noted in his chart that psychological follow-up was recommended. What she had not done was forget the name he said under the anesthesia when they reset the bone. He said Boone twice, very quietly like an apology. She didn't know what it meant. She filed it away the way she filed most things that didn't have an immediate explanation, into a back corner of her mind where things waited until they made sense. She forgot about it for 4 days. And then a woman named Sandra Neff walked into the ER with a broken collarbone and a story that wouldn't stop pulling at the loose threads Lena hadn't even realized she'd been holding. Sandra was a civilian contractor who worked on base. She wasn't supposed to talk about her work. She knew that. She said it twice before she said anything else, which was how Lena knew she was about to say everything. Sandra had been there the morning they brought the dog in from the airport, 2 weeks after his handler was killed overseas. She described a dog that had come off the transport crate, shaking so hard his teeth were clicking, who had lunged at 4 different personnel and refused every command in the book, who had paced his kennel for 36 hours without stopping, and had not once, in the 11 days since, acknowledged that food was being placed in front of him. "They're going to put him down Friday," Sandra said, and her voice cracked on the last word like she'd been holding it in since she found out. "What happened to his handler?" Lena asked. Sandra looked at the ceiling. "That's the part nobody's talking about." Lena went home that night and did not sleep. This was not unusual for her. She had not slept a full night consecutively since nursing school, which she regarded as a kind of professional hazard, like back pain and the ability to eat a full meal in under 4 minutes. What was unusual was what she did instead of sleeping. She sat at her kitchen table with her cat on her lap and thought about the name Corporal Pruitt had said under anesthesia, and about what Sandra Neff had described, and about a dog who had been to war twice and was going to die in a kennel in North Carolina because the systems designed to help him didn't have a category for what he was going through. She thought about her father. Her father, Raymond Farris, had spent 22 years in the Army before a roadside explosion took most of the hearing in his left ear and all of the certainty out of his stride. He came home different in ways that took years to name. He didn't talk about it. He didn't respond to questions. But he had always, in Lena's entire memory of him, responded to dogs. He had a shepherd mix named Keller, who seemed to understand him in a register that language couldn't reach, and watching them together as a child, Lena had learned something she'd never been able to put into words. That some things that have broken in a particular direction can only be reached from that same direction. She picked up her phone at 2 a.m. and sent an email she would later describe, when asked, as the most impulsive thing she'd ever done in her adult life. She sent it to the base veterinary officer, a Dr. Lourdes Casas, whose name she'd gotten from Sandra, who had it on a form she'd processed. The email was 3 sentences. She said she was a trauma nurse who had experience with PTSD presentation in nonverbal patients. She said she had reason to believe the dog's behavior was consistent with acute grief response and not aggression disorder. She said she would like permission to observe. She did not expect a response. She sent the email and went to sleep. Dr. Casas responded at 6:47 a.m. Who are you exactly? The base was 20 minutes from the hospital. Lena drove herself through the main gate on a Thursday morning with a visitor badge that Dr. Casas had arranged, wearing her regular street clothes because she had not been sure whether to wear scrubs and had ultimately decided that wearing scrubs felt like she was pretending to be something she hadn't been invited to be yet. She carried a small bag with a notebook, a bottle of water, and a piece of equipment nobody expected. A short wooden handle attached to a thin disc, like a small cymbal, which she had built herself at 19 using instructions her father had kept in a shoebox under his workbench. He had used it to communicate with Keller when the hearing loss was at its worst. It wasn't complicated. The disc vibrated when tapped. Some dogs trained in high-noise environments, combat dogs, bomb detection dogs, dogs who had worked around gunfire and explosions for years, were sometimes conditioned to respond to vibration cues as backup signals. Her father had figured that out the way he figured out most things, by watching, by being quiet, and by having nothing to lose, Dr. Casas was a small woman in her early 40s with a very direct gaze and the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who had too much to do and had learned not to waste a single step. She met Lena at the entrance to the veterinary facility and looked her up and down in the specific way that Lena recognized as a rapid professional assessment. You're a civilian trauma nurse, Dr. Casas said. Yes, who emailed me at 2 in the morning. It was closer to 2:15. A pause. What's in the bag? Lena told her. Dr. Casas listened without interrupting, which Lena had already begun to understand was the closest she came to expressing approval. When Lena finished, the veterinarian looked at the bag, looked at Lena, and then looked back toward the kennel facility. He put Specialist Hartley in the infirmary on Tuesday, Dr. Casas said. Before that, a staff sergeant named Okafor. I want to be clear with you about what I'm risking professionally by letting a civilian into that kennel. I understand, Lena said. I don't think you do, Dr. Casas said. But I've tried everything else, so. The kennel smelled the way Lena expected. Antiseptic over the damp animal smell beneath, the particular texture of a room that was cleaned too often because everyone was hoping that cleaning would solve something that cleaning couldn't touch. There were 6 dogs in residence. 5 of them acknowledged her presence in the normal ways, ears up, interest, a bark from the far end. The 6th did not move. Boone was in the last kennel on the left. He was lying with his back to the door, his spine pressed into the corner in a posture that Lena recognized immediately. Not from animals, but from people. She had seen patients lie exactly that way in the ICU, facing away from the room, pressing themselves into the smallest possible space, trying to make themselves a smaller target for a world that had already proven it could reach them anywhere. The food bowl beside him was full. The water had been touched. Nothing else had. She did not approach the kennel door. She stood 8 feet back and watched him. She watched him for 45 minutes. Dr. Casas leaned against the far wall and did not say anything, which was either patience or disbelief, and Lena wasn't sure which. She watched the way Boone's breathing changed when the door opened, when someone's shadow crossed his sight line, when the dog at the other end of the row made a sound. She watched the micro-flinches, the involuntary ear flicks, the way his whole body would tighten and then very slowly untighten. The way something that looked like exhaustion and something that looked like grief moved through him in waves he couldn't stop. She had seen this before. She had sat with patients in the first days after catastrophic loss and watched grief work through a body that didn't have the language to process it. The way the nervous system doesn't know the difference between physical threat and emotional devastation. The way both register as danger. The way the only response available is to contract and brace and wait for an impact that keeps not coming. After 45 minutes, she opened her bag and took out the vibration disc. Dr. Casas straightened slightly. Lena held up one hand, wait, and did not look away from the dog. She tapped the disc once, not near the kennel. In the open air, at the full 8-foot distance, a single soft tap, the vibration traveling through the handle into her palm, Boone's ear moved, not toward her, just moved, the involuntary acknowledgement of something registered. Lena waited. She tapped again, twice this time. A pause between them, the way her father had always taught her. Give him a moment to decide whether he's interested. The ear moved again. Then, very slowly, the dog's spine shifted. "He's not going to turn around," Dr. Casas said quietly. Boone turned around, not all the way. His head came off the floor and rotated until he could see her over his shoulder, the Malinois amber eyes finding her face in the way that always caught Lena off guard. That directness, that complete focus, the impression that the dog was not just looking at her, but reading something she hadn't finished writing yet. She held still. She tapped the disc again, one single tap, and waited. Boone stood up. He stood up and turned fully toward her, and then stood there, not moving, watching her with an expression she could only describe later as recognition, not of her specifically, but of the signal, the pattern, the thing that said someone understands the language you were taught. His tail did not wag. His posture was not friendly in any way she could easily name. But he was standing and he was looking at her, and when she very slowly crouched down and tapped the disc against the ground twice, he walked to the kennel door. "God," Dr. Casas said very quietly. Lena didn't move. "What commands was he trained on? We have his record." "Standard English," and Dr. Casas stopped. "German. He was trained with a German-speaking unit." Lena nodded slowly. She had suspected something like this. Not German specifically, but the possibility that the signal gap was linguistic, that a dog trained in a high-stress bilingual environment might have associated one language with safety and the other with something he no longer had access to. The vibration disc wasn't about language, it was about frequency. It was about the nervous system recognizing a pattern and allowing itself, very briefly, to come out of lockdown. "What was his handler's name?" Lena asked. A pause. "Staff Sergeant Dex Crow. He was killed 6 weeks ago." Lena looked at Boone. Boone looked back at her through the kennel door. The space between them was maybe 4 feet, and the space between him and Friday was less than 48 hours, and she was a civilian trauma nurse with a visitor badge and a device she'd built when she was 19 years old. She said quietly, in the tone she used for patients who were frightened and not sure they were allowed to be, "Bleeb. Stay." Boone sat down. What happened after that did not happen quickly or easily, and anyone who has worked in any military or medical institution would know better than to expect it to. Dr. Casas went up 3 levels of command in 2 days to get Lena access to Boone beyond that initial observation. She argued on the grounds of documented behavioral improvement, which meant she had to document it, which meant she had to put her name on a report that acknowledged she'd allowed a civilian trauma nurse to interact with a combat asset. She did it anyway. Lena would later learn that this had cost Dr. Casas a formal reprimand that she accepted without appeal. She did not learn this from Dr. Casas herself. Dr. Casas was not a person who mentioned things like that. The access she was granted was limited and supervised, and came with a list of conditions that ran to 2 pages. She could not touch the dog without a handler present. She could not feed him. She could not enter the kennel alone. She accepted all of it. She showed up on Friday morning, the morning of the scheduled termination, with the paperwork signed and her visitor badge updated and the vibration disc in her bag, and she spent 4 hours with Boone in a controlled environment while a sergeant named Olson stood by the door with his arms crossed and watched like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. Boone ate, for the first time in 11 days, at the end of the 2nd hour. He didn't eat enthusiastically. He ate the way people eat when they remember that they're supposed to, when the body has finally overridden the grief enough to insist on something practical. But he ate, and when she tapped the disc twice and said sits, he sat, and when she said plats, he lay down. And when she tapped once and said nothing, he looked at her and waited, which was the closest she had seen him come to something resembling peace. Sergeant Olson uncrossed his arms somewhere around hour 3. She noticed, but didn't mention it. The termination was postponed. This was not a victory, exactly. It was a pause, and she understood the difference. She was given 2 weeks. 30-minute supervised sessions, 3 times a week, with documentation submitted to Dr. Casas within 24 hours of each visit. She agreed. She rearranged her hospital shifts. She drove to the base 6 times in 14 days and spent those 30 minutes doing something she was increasingly unable to explain in clinical language. She sat with a grieving dog and spoke German commands and tapped a vibration disc that her father had built from instructions in a shoebox, and she watched, slowly, something in Boone decide that the world had not entirely run out of things it could offer him. She also, somewhere in the middle of the second week, started asking questions about Dex Crow. Not loudly. Not in official channels. She asked Dr. Casas, who told her only what was in the record. She asked Sergeant Olson, who said nothing the first time, and then, on the fourth visit, said, "There's a discrepancy in the incident report," and then went quiet in the way of a person who had already said more than they meant to. She filed that away. It came back 3 days later when she was looking at Boone's behavioral record and noticed a notation she hadn't seen before. A timestamp for the evening Staff Sergeant Crow had last been seen alive, and a kennel log entry that showed Boone had been agitated for 4 hours before any official report was filed, which meant the dog had known something was wrong long before the Army's paperwork had caught up to it. She brought this to Dr. Casas, who looked at it for a long time. "That's not my department," Dr. Casas said. "I know," Lena said, "but whose is it?" Dr. Casas wrote a name on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk without looking up. The name was CID Special Agent Tomas Fenn. She did not contact Special Agent Fenn directly, because she was a civilian trauma nurse with no clearance and no standing and no obvious reason to be inserting herself into a military criminal investigation. She understood this. She went home and thought about it for 2 days and then called the one person she knew who had both military experience and an opinion about everything, which was her friend Ingrid, who worked in veterans advocacy and had spent 15 years learning to navigate exactly the kind of institutional wall that Lena was currently staring at. "You need to write everything down," Ingrid said. "Dates, observations, the discrepancy in the timeline. Write it up like a clinical report, not like a hunch. And then you need to give it to someone whose job it is to do something about it. I don't know how to get it to Fenn. You don't need to get it to Fenn. You need to get it to Dr. Casas, who can get it to Fenn, because Dr. Casas has standing and you don't." Lena wrote the report. She wrote it the way she wrote everything clinical. Factually, chronologically, stripped of interpretation, just the observable data in the order in which she had observed it. The kennel log discrepancy, the 4-hour window of Boone's agitation, the timing which did not match the official incident report. She included the behavioral record. She included her own session notes. She included a note at the end that said she was not a trained investigator, that she was only reporting what she had observed, and that she was available to answer questions if that would be useful. She gave it to Dr. Casas on a Tuesday. On Thursday, Dr. Casas called her and told her that Special Agent Fenn had read it and would like to speak with her. She sat down. She was at the nurse's station when she took the call, and one of the other nurses, a woman named Joy, looked at her and said, "You okay?" "Yes," Lena said. "I think something's about to get complicated." "More complicated than it already is?" Lena looked at the phone in her hand. "Probably." She met with Agent Fenn in a conference room on base, which required a new level of visitor clearance and a sign-in process that took 40 minutes and involved a background check she had not been warned about and which was apparently standard, though nobody said anything when it came back clean. Fenn was a quiet man in his late 40s who looked like someone had assembled him from spare parts, very steady eyes, a handshake that revealed nothing. The particular patience of someone who had spent decades listening to people who didn't want to be listened to. He asked her to walk him through the observation. She did. He asked her about the kennel log discrepancy, she explained. He asked how she had come to notice it, and she told him honestly. She had been looking at Boone's behavioral record, and the timestamp stood out because she had a background in trauma nursing, and in trauma nursing, a 4-hour gap between event and report was not a discrepancy, it was a flag. Fenn looked at her for a long moment. "You're not a trained investigator." "No," she said. "You noticed this because of your clinical background." "Yes." He wrote something. She couldn't see what. "How much did Sergeant Olson tell you?" She met his eyes. "He told me there was a discrepancy in the incident report. That's all." Fenn nodded slowly and wrote something else. "What I'm going to tell you now is not classified. It's a matter of ongoing investigation, and I'd ask you to treat it with discretion, which I recognize I'm asking of a civilian who has no obligation to comply." "I understand," she said. "Staff Sergeant Crow's death was initially classified as a training accident," Fenn said. "The investigation has since identified inconsistencies that suggest otherwise." He paused. "Your report added a data point we were missing." The 4-hour window is consistent with a revised timeline that places at least one other individual at the scene before the official report was made. She did not say anything. She sat with what he'd told her and let it settle the way she had learned to let difficult news settle, not rushing it, not filling the silence with something smaller. "Is Boone going to be all right?" she asked. Fenn looked slightly caught off guard. "That's not my jurisdiction." "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there. "Talk to Dr. Casas." The investigation took 4 more months. She was not part of it, and she did not ask to be. She was interviewed once more by Fenn and a second agent whose name she was not given, and she answered everything she was asked as clearly and factually as she could, and then she went back to the hospital and her patient load and her life, which had not stopped needing her attention while she was doing other things. She visited Boone twice a week for those 4 months. His progress was not linear. She had known it wouldn't be. There were sessions where he came to the kennel door immediately when she tapped, where he ate and responded to commands and let her scratch behind his ears in a way that felt, against all professional objectivity, like trust. There were other sessions where he pressed himself into the back corner, and she sat on the floor outside the kennel and simply existed near him, tapping the disc at intervals, saying nothing else, letting her presence be a thing he could habituate to rather than a thing being asked of him. Sergeant Olson stopped crossing his arms. This was the closest he came to commenting on her methods. The formal investigation concluded in late summer. A sergeant first class named Aldrich Veal was charged in connection with Crow's death, manslaughter in the first instance, with evidence of premeditation under review. Lena read about this in a brief report that Dr. Casas forwarded with no commentary. She sat with it for a while. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular heaviness that comes with the confirmation of something you had suspected but hoped to be wrong about. She took Boone for a walk that afternoon. It was the first time he'd been fully off-leash outside the kennel compound, and she stood at the edge of the field and watched him take exactly 5 steps onto the grass and then stop and look at the sky, ears up, the whole of his attention pulled toward something above him. A bird, she thought, or the light. Or maybe just the fact of open space after months in an enclosed room. He stood that way for almost a minute. She did not call him back. She waited. He came back on his own, sat in front of her, looked at her. She tapped the disc once. He put his head against her knee. He was retired from active service 8 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in October, with exactly the amount of ceremony the Army reserved for things it was still figuring out how to feel about. Dr. Casas handled the paperwork. Sergeant Olson attended and did not say anything but stood in the back with his hands behind him and watched with an expression that was not nothing. Lena took him home. This had not been originally the plan. The plan had been to find an adoption placement through the appropriate channels, which Dr. Casas had already begun coordinating. But somewhere around month 3, Boone had started doing something he had not done at the start. He had started watching for her. She would come through the kennel door, and he would already be at the front of his kennel, not distressed, not agitated, just there, like he had heard her coming, like he had been waiting. Dr. Casas had looked at the adoption list and then looked at Lena and said, "You could apply. I'm a civilian in a 1-bedroom apartment," Lena said. "Yes," Dr. Casas said, "and he responds better to you than he has to anyone since Crow." She picked up her pen. "The application is standard. I'll move it to the front of the review." The approval took 6 weeks. She converted half her living room into a sleeping area and took a certification course in trauma-informed animal care and found a German-speaking trainer named Elise Brower who agreed to do monthly check-ins and confirmed, at the first visit, that Boone's training recall was solid and his behavioral presentation had shifted significantly from the acute crisis phase into what she called adaptive grieving, which meant, as best Lena could translate it, that he had found a way to hold what he'd lost while still being willing to be in the present. She understood that. She had spent years watching people do exactly that. She had held the hands of men and women in the first hours after the worst thing, and she had learned that recovery was not the erasure of loss, but the construction of a life that loss could fit inside without breaking everything else. You did not stop grieving. You built around it. You found the signal through the noise and the distance that told you the world still had things in it that recognized you. Boone slept at the foot of her bed. He got better at stairs. He learned that the cat was not a threat, though he remained formally skeptical of this position. He barked once, in January, in the backyard, and then looked surprised at himself, which made her laugh out loud for the first time in what felt like months. The system she built came later. It started as documentation, her session notes from Boone's recovery, the methodology she'd developed, the specific combination of vibration signaling and command language and patient presence that she thought could be formalized. She wrote it up as a clinical framework, tentatively titled something that her friend Ingrid called too long and too clinical, and which Lena eventually shortened to a 4-word phrase that said what she meant: last resort behavioral protocol. It was not a cure. It was not even treatment exactly in the standard sense. It was a set of practices for approaching a military working dog in acute trauma response when standard methods had failed, developed by someone with no veterinary credentials and built on a device from a shoebox. Dr. Casas co-authored the formal paper. She insisted on this. She also insisted that the methodology be submitted through proper channels for review, which took 16 months and involved 2 rounds of revision and 1 presentation to a joint committee that Lena gave in her hospital scrubs because she had not owned a suit since her sister's wedding and did not see the point in buying one for a meeting that would either accept the work or reject it, regardless of what she was wearing. They accepted it. The protocol was adopted as a supplemental assessment tool, not a replacement for standard evaluation, but an option for cases that had exhausted standard options. A tool of last resort, which was, she thought, exactly where tools like this belonged. At the edge, past the point where the usual things had failed, offering something smaller and stranger and maybe enough. She received a letter from the base commander. She filed it. She received a call from a facility in Virginia that had a dog in acute crisis and wanted guidance. She spent 2 hours on the phone and then drove up the following week to observe. She did not have a title for what she was doing. She was a trauma nurse who visited military kennels on her days off and taught people how to listen to animals that no longer trusted language. She trained 12 handlers over the next 2 years. She published a follow-up paper with Dr. Casas. She received a request from a facility in Germany through proper channels, coordinated by Dr. Casas's department, and spent 8 days in Grafenwöhr in the fall, working with a shepherd named Brix who had survived the death of 2 handlers in 3 years, and who responded, on the 3rd day, to a German command he hadn't heard since his first deployment, spoken quietly by a woman who had learned the word from a shoebox her father kept under a workbench. She sat on the floor next to Brix that evening and thought about her father and about Boone, who was at that moment probably sleeping on the couch in her apartment because he had, over the course of 18 months, successfully renegotiated the terms of where he was allowed to sleep. She thought about Dex Crow, whose name she kept in her mind, the way you keep the names of people who mattered to a story without being here to see how it ended. She thought about the 3 days Boone had been given and the 45 minutes she had stood 8 feet from his kennel door and watched him breathe, and the moment his ear moved. That first tiny acknowledgement that something in the world still spoke in a frequency he recognized. The smallest things, she had learned. The smallest things were where everything began. Brix put his head in her lap and didn't move for a long time, and she sat with him in the quiet of the kennel until the light outside the window turned the specific blue-gray of evening, and then she tapped the disc once, gently, the way her father had taught her, and she said bleeb, and she meant, stay, it's all right. I'm not going anywhere, and he stayed.